Every single night, on purpose, someone turns off most of Niagara Falls. You've probably stood at that rail. You never actually saw the real thing. You saw exactly as much as someone, somewhere, had already decided to let through. And that is the polite version. In the summer of 1969, engineers did not dim Niagara Falls. They turned the whole American side off, completely. Tourists walked out across the dry riverbed of one of the most famous waterfalls on Earth. To understand why any of that is even legal, you have to go back to the moment this waterfall nearly engineered itself out of existence. By the early 1900s, Niagara Falls was eroding fast, the lip of Horseshoe Falls chewing backward through solid rock at 2 to 8 feet a year. Do that math forward a century or two, and the most famous waterfall on the continent is not a waterfall anymore. It is a set of rapids with a tourist board still standing next to it, selling postcards of something that used to be there. At the exact same time, the cities crowding both shores of that river wanted something else from it entirely. Cheap, enormous industrial electricity, and as much of it as the river could give. Both problems, engineers realized, had the exact same solution. Pull most of the water away from the edge before it ever gets the chance to fall, and run it through turbines instead. The first limits on that trick, back in 1909, were modest. 20,000 cubic feet a second for the US, 36,000 for Canada. It satisfied nobody. For decades, the two countries argued, negotiated, and quietly broke their own arrangement, each side trying to take a little more without emptying the attraction they were both selling tickets to. Twice more, in 1941 and then again in 1948, they signed temporary deals, bending those old limits even further. Both were meant as stopgaps. Neither one was. The deal that finally settled it, permanently this time, was signed in Washington on February 27, 1950, by the US Secretary of State and Canada's ambassador. And it did something almost nobody expects a treaty to do. It set an exact legal ceiling on how much of a natural wonder the public is even allowed to see. During tourist season, in daylight, the treaty requires at least 100,000 cubic feet of water a second to go over the falls. The moment the clock passes 10 at night, or the season ends, that legal minimum gets cut in half. 50,000. Here is the part that should bother you. Weigh those numbers against how much water the river actually carries on an average day, and something like half of Niagara Falls is quietly missing during daylight hours. After dark, once the tourists have mostly gone home, it edges toward 3/4. Somewhere on that river, right now, there is a person whose actual job is to watch a gauge and make sure that number never drops any further than the treaty allows. Weekly inspections, violations get reported straight back to two governments. And the treaty itself was never really written to protect the waterfall. It was written to protect the performance of one. Alongside those diversion limits, engineers were separately ordered to physically reshape the lip of Horseshoe Falls, moving rock, building underwater weirs, sculpting the exact line the water spills over. So that even with most of the river missing, what remained would still look like one unbroken, overwhelming curtain. Historians studying the project later called the result exactly what it is. A completely engineered, artificial waterfall, wearing the costume of a natural one. But solving one country's power shortage was never going to be free. And the people who ended up footing that bill were not who you would expect. The city of Niagara Falls sits closer to this river than anywhere on the planet. When the power companies most recently renegotiated their rights to keep pulling from it, the city itself was capped at a small, fixed, annual host payment. While a much larger regional development fund worth hundreds of millions over the following decades mostly landed somewhere else along the shoreline. The town living next to the source does not get to flip the switch, and it barely gets a say in what the switch is worth. None of that money moves a single drop of water on its own. 2 power stations do the actual taking, one built into each shore. Gates and tunnels run straight into the riverbed above the falls, quietly funneling water past it before it ever reaches the edge. On the American side, that water drops through a plant finished in 1961, built to replace an earlier station that had already collapsed once, generating enough power on its own for millions of homes. On the Canadian side, a matching set of stations does the same, and together supplies most of an entire province's electricity. And engineers are still expanding it. In 2013, after years of tunneling straight under the city itself, a new diversion tunnel went into service, quietly adding another 18,000 cubic feet a second of capacity, enough for another 160,000 homes. More than 60 years after the treaty was signed, the amount being taken is still going up. None of this has slowed the tourists down. Millions of people still make the trip every single year to stand at that rail, staring at a curtain of water that was, by design, never the whole river to begin with. Which brings us back to that dry riverbed in 1969. Because it turns out that was never a rogue event either. It was the same machine running an extreme version of its ordinary trick. Engineers built a temporary rock dam, dumped close to 30,000 tons of stone across the channel, and sent the entire flow of the American side around it just to study a pile of boulders sitting at its base, left over from an old rock slide decades earlier. What they found down there was not what anyone expected. The ugly pile of rock everyone wanted cleared away turned out to be structural. It was the only thing holding the collapsing cliff face above it in place. Remove it, and you would only speed up the exact erosion the whole treaty existed to slow down. So engineers left it exactly where it was, reinforced what they could with cement and steel, and let the river back in that November. Down on that exposed riverbed, alongside the boulders, crews also recovered human remains, cases the current itself had kept sealed for years. Almost 90,000 people showed up in a single weekend just to see a famous waterfall, standing there, silent and dry. They drove for hours to see the version with no water in it at all. Most of us will only ever see the version with just enough. This was never really a story about a waterfall. Turns out, Niagara Falls has never once shown you how much water it actually has. It shows you exactly how much someone, somewhere, has decided you are allowed to see. And somewhere behind that curtain, right now, tonight, that number is already getting smaller.